In a letter to General Marshall on 11th August, General Harmon, the commander of United States Army forces in the South Pacific, expressed serious doubts about the possible success of the invasion. "The thing that impresses me more than anything else in connection with the Solomon action is that we are not prepared to follow up. We have seized a strategic position from which future operations in the Bismarcks can be strongly supported. Can the Marines hold it? There is considerable room for doubt." A week later, he pointed out that 2 lines of action lay open to the Japanese. They might deliver an amphibious attack, with strong air and surface support, against Guadalcanal and Tulagi, or they might move into New Georgia and infiltrate into Guadalcanal. They probably would not occupy Malaita or San Cristobal, for these would be within fighter range of the newly won Allied base at Guadalcanal, where, to achieve significant results, the Japanese would need to land strong forces. A rapid development of Allied air power at Guadalcanal would render New Georgia untenable for the Japanese. It was Harmon's view that American forces should mount intensive air and surface operations to destroy Japanese surface forces, base fighters, dive bombers, and heavy bombers on Guadalcanal, to replenish Guadalcanal's supplies, and as General Vandergrift desired, send more troops to Guadalcanal at the earliest possible time. Admiral Gormley also stressed the precariousness of the Allied situation in the South Pacific. He warned Admirals King and Nimitz that there could be no further advances until more troops and planes arrived, or until the new positions could be consolidated. If the 3 aircraft carriers then assigned to the South Pacific were to be withdrawn, or if no reinforcements were to be made available, Guadalcanal and other South Pacific positions might fall to the Japanese. Yet using the carriers to support the Guadalcanal garrison, he observed, would be dangerous. Expenditure of carrier-based aircraft and of destroyers in supporting Guadalcanal would jeopardize the carriers, which were then the principal defense of the line of communications between the United States and New Zealand and Australia. Sending supplies by ship to Guadalcanal would be dangerous until planes could be based there. The rapid completion of the airfield on Guadalcanal was a project of the utmost importance, for planes were needed there immediately to protect supply ships and the newly captured position, and to carry on the offensive against the Japanese. On Guadalcanal, work on the uncompleted airstrip had begun on 9th August, when the 1st Engineer Battalion had moved to Lunga Point from Beach Red. The battalion's equipment was inadequate, for the ships had withdrawn before power shovels, bulldozers, or dump trucks had been unloaded. Using abandoned Japanese equipment, the engineers put forth their best efforts and added 1,178 feet to the 2,600 feet of runway completed by the Japanese. To fill a 196-foot gap in the center of the runway, they moved 100,000 cubic feet of earth with hand shovels, trucks, and captured dump cars. At first, there were no steel mats to surface the field, which in consequence was covered with sticky mud after every hard rainfall. On 10th August, General Vandergrift announced that the field, named Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine hero of the Midway battle, might be used by 36 fighters and 9 scout bombers. No ground crews were then present, but there were 400 drums of aviation gasoline and some oil and machine gun ammunition. The first plane to use Henderson Field was a Navy patrol bomber, PBY, which landed for a short time on 12th August. On 17th August, the radio station at Tulagi reported that the field was ready for operation. On 12th August, Admiral Gormley ordered Admiral McCain, commanding Task Force 63, to load all available destroyer transports with aviation gasoline and lubricants, bombs, ammunition, and ground crews, and dispatch them from Espiritu Santo to Guadalcanal. Sending these speedy ships to Guadalcanal bore a close resemblance to blockade running. To avoid being attacked by Japanese planes while lying offshore during daylight, they were to leave Espiritu Santo in time to reach Guadalcanal in the late afternoon, and to depart from there early in the morning. Aircraft of Task Force 63 were to cover them. Admiral Gormley ordered the South Pacific carrier forces to operate generally south of Guadalcanal against Japanese carriers, transports, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and other shipping, in that order of priority. He ordered the carriers not to venture north of latitude 10 degrees south, unless they were pursuing a promising target within striking distance. In addition, Admiral Gormley directed the carrier forces to protect the line of communications between Noumea and Espiritu Santo, and to cover the shipborne movement of ground crews and equipment to Guadalcanal. South Pacific land-based aircraft under Admiral McCain were to serve as a scouting and attack force, sharing with the surface forces the responsibility for defending and supplying Guadalcanal. Admiral McCain was to be responsible for the movement of all airborne supplies and reinforcements to Guadalcanal. The immediate effects of the completion of Henderson Field were disappointing. Air operations were severely limited by lack of equipment. General Harmon believed that this shortcoming stemmed from the fact that the campaign had been viewed by its planners as an amphibious operation supported by air, not as a means of establishing strong land-based air action. The Marines on Guadalcanal could not obtain gasoline, airfield matting, or bulldozers, General Harmon wrote, because the plan did not have as its first and immediate objective the seizure and development of Cactus, Guadalcanal, as an air base. Airdrome construction is going to be disappointingly slow. The Army commander reported on 28 August after an inspection trip, for the Marines lacked enough worthwhile equipment. The primitive conditions obtaining at Henderson Field limited the use of heavy bombers. There were no bomb-handling trucks, no carts, bomb hoists, or gas trucks. All planes had to be fueled from gasoline drums by hand pumps. Further, pending the arrival of sufficient fighters and anti-aircraft guns to defend the field, General Harmon felt that it would be too risky to base B-17s permanently on Guadalcanal, suggesting to General Marshall that Army P-38 fighters be made available to the South Pacific. He also warned that fighters at Henderson Field would experience intensive action and a high attrition rate. Until heavy Army bombers could be based permanently on Guadalcanal, General Harmon suggested staging them from rear bases through Henderson Field to their targets. The B-17s could not carry profitable bomb loads from the New Hebrides directly to Fezi, Gizo, Tonale, Quieta, Recata Bay, Buca, and other targets in the northern Solomons, but they could reach and strike those areas from the New Hebrides by refueling at Guadalcanal and continuing northward. Even with improved defenses at Henderson Field, it would be difficult to stage the B-17s through. A round-trip flight from the New Hebrides to Buca was over 1,800 nautical miles by the shortest route. Henderson Field lay about 560 nautical miles from Espiritu Santo and about 400 nautical miles from Buca. To send 20 B-17s, each carrying 1 ton of bombs, from Espiritu Santo through Henderson Field to Buca, required that 35,800 gallons of gasoline be pumped into the B-17s at Henderson Field by hand, and Henderson's fuel stocks could rarely support such an operation. The first planes arrived for duty at Henderson Field on 20th August. Marine Fighting Squadron 223, VMF 223, and Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 232, VMSB 232, had reached Noumea from Pearl Harbor on the escort carrier Long Island. From Noumea they flew to the New Hebrides, refueled, and continued their way to Henderson Field. These squadrons, the forward echelon of Marine Air Group 23 of Brigadier General Roy S. Geiger's 1st Marine Air Wing, included 19 Grumman fighters F-4 F-4s and 12 Douglas dive bombers SBD-3s. 11 dive bombers of Flight 300 from the carrier Enterprise landed at Henderson Field on 24th August, to remain there for 3 months. The 1st Army Air Force plane's 5 P-400s of the 67th Fighter Squadron came on 22nd August, and were followed on 27th August by 9 more. The 67th Fighter Squadron had debarked at Noumea, New Caledonia, on 15th March 1942, and had trucked its crated aircraft over the mountains along the narrow twisting trail and the Little Burma Road which led to the squadron's base. When the squadron's mechanics uncrated the planes, they discovered 45 P-400s, a converted model of the P-39 designed for export to the British, and 2 P-39Fs. None of the pilots had ever flown a P-400 before, and only 2 had flown a P-39. None of the mechanics had ever worked on a P-400, and no instruction books for this type had been included in the shipment. However, they successfully assembled the planes, and the pilots learned to fly them. To get from New Caledonia to Henderson Field, the P-400s flew the 277 nautical miles from New Caledonia to F8, then the 153 nautical miles from F8 to Espiritu Santo, and, using extra gasoline tanks and guided by a B-17, flew the 560 nautical miles to Henderson Field. Operations of the P-400s were disappointing at first. They could not fly higher than 12,000 feet, and thus were no match for high-flying Japanese aircraft. It was standard practice, when Henderson Field was warned of air attack, for the Army P-400s and Marine SBDs to take off from the field before the raid to prevent these vulnerable craft from being destroyed on the ground. During the raids they strafed and bombed Japanese positions. The P-400's armor, its 20mm cannon and 2.50 and 4.30 caliber machine guns, and its ability to carry one 500-pound bomb made this plane extremely effective in close support of ground troops. On 20th August, when Henderson Field began operating, supply and evacuation by air were inaugurated by the twin-engine R-4Ds C-47s of Marine Air Group 25. These planes made daily flights from Espiritu Santo to Guadalcanal, usually bringing in 3,000-pound cargo loads, and evacuating 16 litter patients per trip. The combat troops on Guadalcanal began to construct defenses for the airfield immediately after its capture. Since they lacked enough tools, sandbags, or barbed wire, the work was difficult. A small quantity of wire was salvaged from the coconut plantations and added to the original 18 spools. Captured rice bags served in place of sandbags. By the afternoon of 9th August, hasty positions had been established. Considering that an enemy amphibious attack against the shoreline was the most immediate danger, General Vandergrift concentrated the bulk of his strength to hold the beaches. The Marines built a defense along 9,600 yards of shoreline from the mouth of the Ilu River to the village of Kukum. The right flank was refused inland 600 yards along the west bank of the Ilu, where the riverline would give the defending forces a tactical advantage. The left or west flank line at Kukum was refused inland over the flat ground between the beach and the jungle to the first hills. Caliber .30 and .50 machine guns and 37mm guns, supported by riflemen, defended the beachfront. The 5th Marines Less 1 Battalion held the left sector, from the Lunga to Kukum. The 1st Marines held the right, from the Lunga to the Ilu. Except for troops required to cover the beach defense weapons, the infantry battalions were concentrated inland to be in position to launch counterattacks, or to contain any forces which might penetrate the beach line. In the south inland, a 9,000-yard-long stretch of jungle running from the Ilu across the Lunga to Kukum posed a grave problem. The northern line along the shore of Lunga Point ran across ground which was generally flat and covered with even rows of coconut trees. But the inland line ran up and down steep, heavily jungled ridges and hills where visibility was extremely limited. There were not enough troops to hold a continuous line in the south sector, and the rough, tangled terrain increased the difficulty of maintaining contact between separated units. Local security detachments from the artillery, pioneer, engineer, and amphibian tractor battalions first held separated strong points in the southern sector, until continual nocturnal enemy infiltration made necessary an outpost line between the Ilu and the Lunga. However, large-scale enemy operations in the south sector at first seemed unlikely because of the difficult terrain. Mortars, 60mm and 81mm, were placed in supporting positions for normal fire missions. The 1st Special Weapons Battalion dug in its 75mm tank destroyers in positions inland, but were ready to move to firing positions on the beach in the event of an attack. The troops dug foxholes, slit trenches and dugouts to protect themselves from enemy rifle, artillery, and naval gunfire, and from the frequent bombing raids. On the outpost and beach lines, the troops built 2-man foxholes fitted with fire slits. Deep pits to catch rolling hand grenades were dug in front of these emplacements. There was not enough artillery. The 2nd, 3rd, and 5th Battalions of the 11th Marines had landed their howitzers and set them up in central positions from which they could put fire in front of all sectors. The 2nd and 3rd Battalions had 75mm pack howitzers, the 5th Battalion, 105mm howitzers. There were no 155mm howitzers or guns for effective counter-battery fire, nor any sound and flash units for locating enemy artillery pieces, a deficiency that was to prove costly. The defenses against air and surface attack were to be inadequate for many weeks. The radars and 5-inch seacoast guns of the 3rd Defense Battalion had not been brought ashore prior to the hasty departure of the amphibious force. Automatic anti-aircraft weapons, 90mm guns, and searchlights, however, had been landed on both Guadalcanal and Tulagi. An air warning system was obviously necessary, and one was established on 9th August in the pagoda, a tower which the Japanese had built on the airfield. From the pagoda, observers could alert the Lunga garrison before an air attack by sounding a siren which the Japanese had abandoned. The adequacy of the defenses against Japanese ground attacks was soon to be tested. The Japanese forces on Guadalcanal in August 1942 were believed to be concentrated near Lunga Point, between the Matanikau River, approximately 7,000 yards beyond Lunga Point, and the native village of Kokumbona, about 7,500 yards west of the Matanikau. A prisoner captured on 12th August confirmed this belief, and intimated that some of the Japanese garrison, many of whom were believed to be wandering aimlessly without food, might be willing to surrender First Sergeant Stephen A. Custer of the Division Intelligence Section prepared a plan to take a patrol by boat from Kukum to the Matanikau area to make contact with the Japanese and give them an opportunity to surrender. Colonel Frank Goich, the Division Intelligence Officer, decided to lead the patrol himself. The patrol embarked from Kukum about dusk on 12 August. Colonel Getge had planned to land between the Matanikau River and Point Cruz, about 1,200 yards west of the river, but in the darkness he landed at an unknown spot somewhere west of the river. The Japanese, instead of surrendering, attacked the patrol and annihilated all but 3 men who escaped by swimming. Colonel Getge, 3 other officers, and Sergeant Custer were among the casualties. Subsequent patrols never found any traces of Colonel Goich's party. A vigorous effort 1 week later to clear Matanikau and Kokombona villages west of the river mouth met with greater success when B, L, and I companies of the 5th Marines attacked the villages from 3 sides. I Company took landing craft to the beach west of Kokombona, landed, and pushed east through the village, while B and L companies attacked Matanikau from the east and south. L Company, having crossed the river about 1,000 yards upstream from its mouth, attacked northward after a brief artillery preparation by the 2nd, 3rd, and 5th Battalions of the 11th Marines. As L Company advanced, it met rifle fire from enemy emplacements on the ridges to its front and left flanks. By 14 o'clock the company had reached the outskirts of Matanikau village. Meanwhile, enemy fire had prevented B Company from crossing from the east bank over the sandbar at the river mouth. B Company engaged the Japanese in the village with rifle and machine gun fire, while L Company pushed through the village. The 3 companies annihilated about 65 Japanese, themselves losing 4 annihilated and 11 wounded, before returning to Lunga Point. As the division commander wrote later, this skirmish did not affect the outcome of the campaign, but did reveal the location of those Japanese who had retreated from the Lunga area. The Matanikau River, flowing through a deep valley, was to prove an important terrain feature. Deep, swift, and about 160 feet wide, it could not be forded in the coastal area. In the absence of bridges, the alluvial sandbar across the mouth was the only means by which vehicles and artillery could cross the river. To protect Henderson Field from artillery fire, it was essential that the Marines hold the easily defended east bank, but not until the addition of more troops to the Lunga garrison would enough men be available to extend the lines from Kukum to the Matanikau. During the first weeks on Guadalcanal, the white coast watchers and friendly natives were proving their value. The coast watchers were performing an invaluable service for the Allied cause by giving warning of approaching enemy aircraft almost 3 hours before their arrival over the Lunga. In August, coast watchers were stationed on the south coast of Guadalcanal and on Buca, Bougainville, New Georgia, Santa Isabel, and Malaita to radio reports on Japanese aircraft and ship movements to the intelligence section of the division. Since most enemy bomber flights from Rabo passed over New Georgia, the coast watcher on that island was especially valuable, and his reports usually enabled the United States fighter planes on Guadalcanal to take to the air in time to meet the oncoming enemy. Other sources of intelligence were reports from higher headquarters, observation posts, regimental and battalion patrols, and air reconnaissance. The few Japanese captured during the campaign usually poured out information voluminously. Also useful to the Allied cause was the Japanese habit of carrying orders, diaries, and other documents to the front lines. A vast quantity of such papers was captured on Guadalcanal and sent to Noumea. Shortly after the 1st Division had landed, Captain Martin Clemens of the British Solomon Islands Defence Force, who was also British District Officer for Guadalcanal in the Protectorate government, left Vangana, his hiding place in the hills south of Iola Bay. With his 60 native scouts, he entered the Marine lines to offer their services to General Vandergrift, who accepted. On 19 August came the first evidence that Japanese ground forces were planning to attack the Lunga airfield. Patrols had already informed division headquarters that the Japanese were operating a radio station about 35 miles east of Lunga Point. Ordered to patrol the coast eastward to locate the enemy, a company of the 1st Marines surprised a Japanese party of 4 officers and 30 enlisted men walking openly along the beach near Taivu Point, about 22 statute air miles east of Lunga Point. The company annihilated all the Japanese but 2 who escaped into the jungle. Examination of the dead men's effects revealed that these were enemy soldiers who had recently landed. Their helmets bore the Army Star instead of the anchor and chrysanthemum insignia of the Special Naval Landing Forces. Among the documents which a company captured was a code for ship-to-shore communication during landing operations. That an enemy force might attack by land against the 1st Marine Division's east flank or force a landing against the Lunga shore defenses in an effort to recapture the airfield, or to attempt both, was an inescapable conclusion. Headquarters of the Japanese 17th Army at Rabaul, acting on orders issued from Tokyo on 13th August, had just assumed responsibility for directing ground operations on Guadalcanal, but its intelligence estimates were extremely inaccurate. The landing on 7th August had taken the Japanese by surprise. They had retaliated with surface and air attacks, but there were not enough troops under 17th Army Command to permit the immediate dispatch of strong forces to Guadalcanal. The Japanese thought that a small force had been landed on 7th August. Some estimated that only 1,000 American troops had come ashore. The Japanese army apparently based its estimates of the forces needed to destroy the American beachhead upon its experiences in China and Malaya. The officer who was later to become Chief of Staff of the 17th Army, Major General Shucho Miyazaki, was then in Tokyo. He wrote later that, "At that time we had no means of ascertaining actual facts regarding the extent of the enemy counteroffensive." The 17th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, had decided to retake the Lunga area. Hyakutake planned to use initially a force composed of part of the 28th Infantry of the 7th Division and the Yokosuka Special Naval Landing Forces, and later the 35th Brigade, about 6,000 troops in all. The 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry, had been formed into a 2,000-man combat team of infantry, artillery, and engineers known as the Ichiki Force, after its commander, Colonel Kiyono Ichiki. This force had been attached to the Navy to make the projected landing on Midway. When the Japanese carrier fleet was defeated, the Ichiki Force had sailed for Guam. On 7th August, when the force was at sea bound for Japan, it received orders to reverse its course. Landing at Truk on 12th August, it was attached to the 35th Brigade, which was then in the Palau Islands. This brigade, commanded by Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, was usually called the Kawaguchi Force. The first echelon, about 1,000 men of the Ichiki Force, including Colonel Ichiki, sailed for Guadalcanal via Rabaul. They made the trip from Rabaul to Guadalcanal on the Tokyo Express, the Japanese destroyers and cruisers which operated at night among the islands. This echelon landed at Taivu Point about 18th August, at approximately the same time that 500 men of the Yokosuka 5th Special Naval Landing Force landed at Kokumbona. The soldiers whom a company of the 1st Marines had annihilated on 19th August were from Ichiki's first echelon. Ichiki apparently decided to attack immediately because his forces had been discovered, for he did not wait for his second echelon to land before advancing west against the airfield. The 1st Marine Division was then holding Lunga Point with 4 infantry battalions in line, 1 in reserve, and 3 field artillery battalions in support. As division headquarters was not sure of the size of the enemy force to the east, nor even certain that one had been landed, it could not risk sending troops beyond the front lines to attack the enemy. The Marines continued to work on the defences and extended the eastern line farther inland, along the west bank of the Ilu. The first important ground action on Guadalcanal, after the landing, opened on the evening of 20th August when Marines in listening posts on the east bank of the Ilu opened fire at some enemy troops hidden in the jungle. They then fell back to the west bank to report that enemy forces were moving up from the east. Some rifle fire followed, then subsided. The Ilu front lay quiet until about 3:10 a.m., 21st August, when about 200 infantrymen of the Ichiki Force tried to cross the sandbar at the mouth of the Ilu in a bayonet attack, designed to overrun the positions occupied by the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. The defending battalion had emplaced a 37mm gun, protected by machine guns and rifles, to cover the 45-yard-wide sandbar. As the Japanese drew near, the 2nd Battalion opened fire with rifles, machine guns, and the 37mm gun which was firing canister. A few of the Ichiki Force succeeded in crossing the bar to overrun some of the 2nd Battalion's positions which were not protected by barbed wire. The majority were annihilated or wounded by the defenders' fire. The few who had crossed were prevented from reorganizing or extending their foothold by fire from the positions which the 2nd Battalion had been able to hold. G Company of the 2nd Battalion then counterattacked and drove the enemy survivors back across the river. The Ichiki Force installed itself along the beach east of the river mouth. At 4:03 a.m., the 3rd Battalion, 11th Marines, which had previously registered on the area, put howitzer fire on the narrow triangle of beach from which the Ichiki Force had begun the attack, and repeated the concentrations at 5:15 a.m., 7:22 a.m., 7:42 a.m., and 8:51 a.m., When the initial rush failed, the Ichiki Force concentrated artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire on the marine positions at the end of the sandbar. All available marine weapons replied immediately. From their positions on the west bank, the Marines enfiladed the enemy on the sandbar and beach, and by morning the sluggish river mouth was filled with enemy corpses. By daybreak it was apparent that the 2nd Battalion, aided by artillery support and the tactical advantages of its position, could hold the west bank of the Ilu. The 1st Battalion of the 1st Marines was ordered out of Division Reserve to cross the Ilu upstream to attack the enemy left flank and rear. The 1st Battalion crossed the river in column and posted one heavy weapons platoon to cover the Japanese escape route. By 12:30, 21st August, C and A companies had advanced over 2,000 yards, and C Company, on the right, had reached the mouth of the Block 4 River in the rear of the Japanese. When the enemy was surrounded, at 14 hours, the battalion delivered its attack. Some Japanese ran into the sea in an effort to escape, and D Company stopped some who were attempting to retreat inland. Others fleeing to the east were attacked by fighter planes. To conclude the engagement before dark and to destroy some obdurate enemy machine gunners at the west end of the beach, a platoon of light tanks, supported by infantry, crossed the sandbar at 15 hours, and with 37mm canister and machine gun fire attacked the Ichiki Force survivors and destroyed them. 2 tanks suffered light damage, but by 17 hours the engagement had ended. The attacking Japanese force had been destroyed, and Ichiki committed suicide. Japanese casualties numbered almost 800, only 130 survived. 35 Marines had been annihilated, 75 wounded. Captured Japanese materiel included 10 heavy and 20 light machine guns, 20 grenade dischargers, 700 rifles, 20 pistols, an assortment of sabers and grenades, 3 70mm guns, 12 flamethrowers which were not used in the engagement, and demolition equipment. 1 Japanese had surrendered, and 14, of whom 12 were wounded, had been taken prisoner. At no time had the Ichiki Force seriously threatened the airfield. The amazingly small force which attacked the Marines indicated either defective intelligence work or sublime confidence on the part of the enemy. If by 20th August Ichiki had become aware of the numerical strength of the Americans he was attacking, he must have had complete contempt for the military prowess of the Marines. Before the Ichiki Force had launched its hopeless attack, the Japanese had attempted to send a second force to Guadalcanal. An impressive amount of naval strength had been concentrated near Rabaul. By 23rd August, Allied air reconnaissance reports led to the estimate that there were 3 or 4 aircraft carriers, 1 or 2 battleships, from 7 to 15 light and heavy cruisers, from 10 to 20 destroyers, 15 or more transports, cargo ships and oilers, and 160 land-based aircraft at Rabaul. The increase in enemy naval strength since early August led to the conclusion that the Japanese were preparing to put a major force ashore on Guadalcanal. Admiral Gormley's naval forces were weaker than those of the Japanese. Total American naval strength in the South Pacific included 3 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, 6 cruisers, and 18 destroyers, organized into 3 carrier task forces under Admiral Fletcher's command. A 4th force, built around the Hornet, had left Pearl Harbor on 17th August and reached the South Pacific on 29th August after the Battle of the Eastern Solomons had ended. 39 PBYs and 30 B-17s, plus the Guadalcanal aircraft, were also available in the South Pacific. 4 Japanese transports carrying about 1,500 men of the second echelons of the Ichiki Force and the Yokosuka 5th Special Naval Landing Force, screened by 4 destroyers, had left Rabaul on 19th August to attempt to land the troops on Guadalcanal on 24th August. 2 screening units were sailing south about 100 miles to the east. The total enemy force included 3 aircraft carriers, 8 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 21 destroyers, as well as the 4 transports. The 25th Air Flotilla at Rabaul provided land-based air cover. The 3 United States carrier task forces under Fletcher were then operating about 100 miles southeast of Guadalcanal. When erroneous intelligence reports on 23rd August led to the belief that the Japanese naval forces had retired north of Truk, the WASP force departed from the main body to refuel, leaving only 2 carrier forces under Fletcher's command, including the carriers Saratoga and Enterprise, 1 battleship, 4 cruisers, and 10 destroyers. That the Japanese had not retired but intended to attack became clear on 23rd August after the WASP's departure, when American patrol planes sighted the 4 transports about 350 miles north of Guadalcanal. The next day, 24th August, American carrier planes discovered the enemy screening forces about the same time that Japanese pilots located Admiral Fletcher's ships. The ensuing engagement, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, was fought well to the east of Guadalcanal. Like that at Midway, it was a battle of aircraft against ships. Surface craft did not exchange a single shot. American land-based aircraft joined the carrier planes to attack the enemy ships, and some Japanese planes bombed the Lunga area on 25th and 26th August. The Japanese lost the carrier Ryuho, 1 destroyer, 1 light cruiser sunk, 90 planes shot down, and the seaplane carrier Cheetos and 1 cruiser damaged. The Enterprise suffered damage, and 20 American planes were lost. Late on 24th August, Admiral Fletcher retired southward, expecting to return and resume the fight next day. But the Japanese force also withdrew, and by next morning, 25th August, was out of range. Marine dive bombers and Army B-17s attacked the enemy transport force on 25th August, and search planes located other scattered enemy ships converging toward Guadalcanal. By noon, the Japanese ships everywhere in the southern Solomons had reversed their courses to follow the carriers northward. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons did not prevent the Japanese from landing troops on Guadalcanal, but it did postpone their landing for a few days. The postponement gave the 1st Marine Division more time to strengthen its defenses. After the victory in the Eastern Solomons, the naval force of the South Pacific, already weakened by the return of 9 cruisers and destroyers to the Southwest Pacific, lost several more ships in action, but did not inflict serious damage upon the enemy. On 31st August, the Saratoga, patrolling west of the Santa Cruz Islands, was hit by an enemy torpedo. The crippled carrier reached Tongatabu safely, made emergency repairs, and on 12th September sailed for Pearl Harbor, where she remained incapacitated until November. The Wasp, patrolling south and east of the Solomons, sank on 15th September after being struck by 3 torpedoes from enemy submarines. The battleship North Carolina, escorting the Wasp, was torpedoed on the same day and forced to return to Pearl Harbor. The South Pacific thus lost the services of 4 major fleet units. Its carrier strength was reduced to 1, the Hornet. The lack of provision for resupply and reinforcement of the 1st Marine Division, the withdrawal of the supporting naval forces from Guadalcanal, the cruiser losses at Savo Island, and the failure to complete the unloading of the transports of the amphibious force had placed the division in a precarious situation. Having embarked 60 days' supplies to obtain freedom of action, General Vandergrift had been able to bring less than 1/2 that amount ashore. The lack of shipping, combined with air and surface weakness, would have prevented a free and rapid flow of Allied forces and supplies to Guadalcanal, even if unlimited troops and material had been available to the South Pacific. To complicate matters further, the fact that the Japanese were free to land strong forces on Guadalcanal protracted the campaign for 6 months, and required the commitment of many more American troops than had been originally planned. After landing on Guadalcanal, the Marines had begun to move the supplies from Beach Red to Lunga Point immediately. Fortunately, the Japanese aircraft had not bombed or strafed Beach Red during the crucial period when a tangle of rations, ammunition, spare parts, and other material lay exposed. But the supplies had to be moved quickly, lest the Japanese exploit the opportunity they had hitherto missed. The division, which had landed only 30% of its authorized 2.5-ton trucks, put to use every available vehicle, including artillery prime movers, amphibian tractors, and captured Japanese trucks. The pioneers repaired a Japanese-built bridge over the Lunga and improved the coast road. Beach Red was cleared in 5 days of hauling. The supplies were segregated and dispersed throughout Lunga Point. Observation of the results of the naval bombardment and air attacks on D-Day showed the Marines that the probability of damage to supplies varied directly in proportion to the vertical height of the dump. The dumps were therefore kept at the lowest possible heights. The 1st Marine Division, expecting that its 60 days' supplies would prove ample, had naturally not made provision for immediate resupply. When advanced supply depots were established at Noumea and Espiritu Santo on 20th August by order of Admiral Turner, they were not under divisional control. On Guadalcanal, the movement of supplies brought in by ships proved difficult. Once the beachhead was secured, the handling of supplies from the beach to supply dumps was theoretically a naval responsibility. The nucleus of a naval operating base had been formed on 9th August by landing craft and crews from the amphibious force, but there were not enough men for effective operation. The division pioneers, later supplemented by hired native labor, continued to unload ships until October, when enough sailors to perform this duty had arrived. All supplies had to be lighted from the ships to the beaches, unloaded, placed aboard trucks, and hauled inland. but there were never enough trucks. The arrival of reinforcing units did not alleviate the shortage of 2.5-ton trucks, for, to save cargo space, only 1.5-ton trucks were now being shipped. No major reinforcements were sent in during the first month. Before Admiral Turner's departure on 9th August, Van der Grift had recommended that the 2nd Marines remain with the division instead of occupying Denny, and most of the 2nd Marines landed before Admiral Turner's departure. Admiral Gormley agreed to Van der Grift's proposal, and on 9th August he directed the 2nd Marines to remain in the Guadalcanal-Tulagi area if they had already landed. The remainder of the regiment, 1,390 men, debarked at Espiritu Santo on 12th August. Colonel Arthur, commanding the 2nd Marines, and his staff remained at Espiritu Santo for a few days, and on 22nd August landed at Tulagi from the Alhena. The first ships to reach Guadalcanal after the landing were destroyer transports which on 15th August put ashore aviation ground crews and supplies. By 20th August, when the bulk of Task Force 62 was operating out of Noumea, 6 destroyer transports had been assembled to run between Espiritu Santo and Guadalcanal. The next day, the destroyer transports Colquhoun, Gregory and Little brought 120 tons of rations, enough for 3.5 days, to Guadalcanal, and the seaplane tender McFarland landed more aviation material. The original plan of 12th August for the destroyer transports to operate under McCain was changed on 17th August, when Admiral Gormley charged Turner's force, Task Force 62, with the responsibility of establishing the line of communications to Guadalcanal. Task Force 62 was to defend and strengthen the Marine garrison there. Turner would plan and control all surface movements to Guadalcanal, including that of aviation personnel and material. Admiral McCain was to notify Turner whenever such personnel and supplies were available for shipment by water. The arrival of fighter planes at Henderson Field permitted large ships to enter Sealark Channel in daylight with some degree of safety. The cargo ships Alhena and Fomalhaut, escorted by destroyers, succeeded in landing some supplies and weapons during daylight on 22nd and 23rd August, although one of the destroyers was torpedoed and sunk. 7 destroyer transports and destroyers brought supplies to Guadalcanal and Tulagi on 29th August. The small amounts involved in these shipments may be illustrated by the fact that the Colquhoun was carrying only 17 tons of stores when she was sunk in the afternoon of 30th August during an attack on the ships by 18 enemy bombers. By the end of August, the 1st Marine Division was in a slightly stronger position than had been the case on 9th August. The defences of the airfield had been established, the field was in operation, the Ichiki Force had been defeated, and a tenuous line of communications between Espiritu Santo and Guadalcanal had been established. But the Americans were not yet firmly established on Guadalcanal. Insufficiency of troops and weapons imposed severe limitations on the Marine garrison at Lunga Point. The number of troops available to General Van der Grift in late August and early September was too small to permit a sufficient extension of his defences for the protection of Henderson Field from infantry attacks and artillery bombardments. He believed that to prevent enemy landings and protect the field, a 45-mile-long stretch of Guadalcanal's north coast should be held. But with less than 20,000 troops on Lunga Point, only a small area could be securely defended. Not until more troops arrived could offensive action be undertaken to keep the Japanese beyond artillery range of Henderson Field. In late August and early September, the Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were not able to mount sustained attacks against the Lunga defences, but aircraft and warships exerted almost continuous pressure by repeated bombardments. Almost daily, Japanese bombers from Rabaul attacked Henderson Field at noon during August, September and October. A few warships and submarines sailed into Sealark Channel nearly every night to shell the airfield. General Van der Grift, forced to remain on the defensive within a restricted area, concentrated on the improvement of his air defences while awaiting the arrival of more troops and supplies. Radars and 5-inch guns of the 3rd Defence Battalion had been added to the Lunga defences in late August. The 5-inch guns of the battalion's 2 coastal batteries were equipped with permanent mounts. These guns, landed without their trailers and sleds, were manhandled into positions on the beach east and west of the Lunga River, a task requiring 10 days of hard labour. Set up on the beach to cover the channel, the 5-inch guns were frequently in action against Japanese warships, but lacked enough hitting power to be completely effective. 3 automatic weapons and 2 90mm anti-aircraft batteries were assigned to the defence of the airfield before the end of August. And in early September, following the landing of anti-aircraft guns of a detachment of the 5th Defence Battalion on Tulagi, 1 more 90mm battery of the 3rd Defence Battalion was transferred from Tulagi to Guadalcanal. But the battalion could not provide a complete defence. The Lunga beachhead was too restricted to permit the posting of pickup searchlights where they could illuminate attacking aircraft soon enough for the gun batteries to fire with complete effectiveness. To catch a plane early in its bombing run would have necessitated placing the lights at points 6,000 to 10,000 yards from the batteries. In September, however, the beachhead was less than 10,000 yards east to west and less than 5,000 yards north to south. The radar sets supplied to the 3rd Defense Battalion were not uniformly good. The long-range warning set, Signal Corps Radio 270, worked well, but the Signal Corps Radio 268, a primitive set originally designed for searchlight control, was not accurate enough for controlling 90mm gunfire at night. The guns of only one of the 3 90mm batteries were equipped with remote control systems, by means of which they could be automatically trained by the gun-laying fire control directors. In the other 2 batteries, the guns had to be trained by hand, a much less accurate method. During daylight, fighter aircraft could usually afford Henderson Field reasonably adequate protection against enemy planes, but at night anti-aircraft guns provided the main defense. The effectiveness of Henderson Field's aircraft was demonstrated on 24 August when Marine fighters intercepted the regular noon Japanese bombing attack and destroyed 5 twin-engine and 5 single-engine bombers and 11 fighters. The Marines lost 3 fighters and their pilots. But the accuracy of General Harmon's prediction that the attrition rate would be heavy was proved the next day when General Vandergrift reported to Admiral Turner that of the 31 Marine aircraft which had arrived on 20th August only 20 remained serviceable. 1 fighter had crashed on the field, 4 had been lost in action, and 3 were being repaired. 1 bomber had crashed, and 2 were being repaired. General Vandergrift requested more planes, and on 29th August he repeated his request. Just 8 Grumman fighters, the only planes with the ability to attain enough altitude to intercept the Japanese, remained in commission, although all 14 of the P-400s were operational. The next day the P-400s fought with the Japanese and destroyed 5 planes, but lost 4 of their own number. By 30th August only 5 of the original Grumman fighters would fly, but 29 more fighters and dive bombers had reached Henderson Field. Admiral McCain suggested that 2 more F-4F or P-38 squadrons be used at Henderson Field. If this were done, he believed, Allied air strength would turn Guadalcanal into a sinkhole for Japanese air power. Admiral Gormley, asserting that Guadalcanal could not be defended without more fighters, concurred with McCain. When Admiral Gormley asked General MacArthur for P-38s, the Southwest Pacific commander replied that he had in his theatre only 6 operational P-38s which he needed badly, but he promised P-39s at a later date. Throughout September, the lack of adequate fighter strength continued to be serious, and the lack of sufficient air supplies and ground crews prevented the field from being used as a permanent base for heavy bombers. The inability of the P-400s to fight at high altitudes required that all aircraft which could be spared from the Enterprise and the Saratoga be used at Henderson Field. Admiral Nimitz and General Harmon also asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff for high-altitude Army fighters, but none were immediately available. Yet fighters were absolutely essential for the security of Lunga Point, which was being raided almost daily by Japanese bomber forces. On 10 September 11, Grumman fighters rose to meet a flight of 27 twin-engine bombers, escorted by 30 Zeros that attacked at 12:25. 4 bombers were destroyed for the loss of 1 Grumman. Despite their limited numbers, the effectiveness of American planes and tactics was being constantly demonstrated against the Japanese. 1 patrolling B-17 destroyed 4 attacking fighters on 12 September. The next day another shot down 2 more. On the same day, 6 Grumman torpedo bombers and 12 more dive bombers arrived at Guadalcanal to strengthen the meager air forces, and 20 F-4Fs intercepted a flight of 28 escorted twin-engine bombers 14 miles north of Henderson Field. The Marine fighters attacked, shot down 4 bombers and 4 fighters, and forced the rest of the bombers to jettison their bombs and retire. The Japanese, pressing their attacks in spite of these losses, sorely tested the endurance of the defenders of Henderson Field. The feelings of the men who suffered the bombardments are expressed by the historian of the 67th Fighter Squadron. Almost daily, and almost always at the same time noon, Tojo time the bombers came. There would be 18 to 24 of them, high in the sun and in their perfect V of V's formation. They would be accompanied by 20 or more Zeros, cavorting in batches of 3, nearby. Their bombing was accurate, and they would stay in formation and make their bombing run even as they knew the deadly fire from the Grummans would hit any minute. There was a routine of noises at Tojo time. First, the red and white flag, a captured Japanese rising sun, would go up at the pagoda. That meant scramble. Every airplane that would fly would start up immediately, and all would rush for the runway, dodging bomb craters. Often, through the swirling dust, the ground crews would see a wing drop. That meant another plane had taxied into a dud hole or a small crater, indistinct in the tall grass. The first planes to the runway took off first, and two at a time, whether Grummons, dive bombers, or P-400s. The formations would join later in the air. The P-400s and dive bombers would fly away to work over the Japanese territory. The Grummons would climb for altitude, test firing their guns on the way. The whining of engines at high revolutions per minute, the chatter of machine guns and settling dust. On the ground, the men would put in a few more minutes' work, watching the pagoda all the while. Then the black flag would go up. It was amazing how fast the tired and hungry men could sprint. In a moment, the field would be deserted. Then the high sing-song whine of the bombers would intrude as a new sound, separate from the noise of the climbing Grummons. Only a few moments now, the sing-song would grow louder. Then, swish, 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 and the men would pull the chin straps of their helmets tighter and tense their muscles and press harder against the earth in their foxholes. And pray. Then, wham! Means the first one hit. Wham! Closer. Wham! Walking right up to your foxhole. Wham! Oh Christ! Wham! Thank God they missed us. Wham! The bombs were walking away. Wham! They still shook the earth, and dirt trickled in. Wham! It was over. The men jumped out to see if their buddies in the surrounding foxholes had been hit. The anti-aircraft still made a deafening racket. Grass fires were blazing. There was the pop-pop-pop of exploding ammunition in the burning airplanes on the ground, the reek of cordite. Overhead, the Grummons dived with piercing screams, and the Japanese bombers left smoke trails as they plummeted into the sea. In a little while, the airplanes would return. The ground crews would count them as they landed. The ambulance would stand, engine running, ready for those who crashed, landed dead stick, or hit the bomb craters in the runway. Then the work of patching and repairing the battered fighters would start again. But naval shelling were much worse. A bombing is bad, because as the big planes drone overhead, the whole field seems to shrink up to the size of your foxhole, and when the bombs start to swish, swish, swish in their fall, they seem to be aimed right at that tiny spot. But a bombing is over in a minute. A shelling, however, is unmitigated, indescribable hell. It can go on for a few minutes or 4 hours. When the shells scream overhead, you cringe expecting a hit, and when there is a let-up, you tremble knowing that they are getting their range and the next one will be a hit. During early September, the flow of supplies to the beleaguered garrison on Lunga Point increased slightly, for the American victory in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons effected a greater measure of security for the line of communications between Espiritu Santo and Guadalcanal. The destroyer Helm towed 3 harbour patrol boats to Tulagi on 31st August. The transport Beetlejuice put 200 men of the 6th Naval Construction Battalion ashore on 1st September. The Fomalhaut and 3 destroyer transports landed more supplies on 3rd September. The destroyer transports Little and Gregory followed on the next day, when the Gregory took the 1st Raider Battalion on a patrol to Savo Island. No Japanese were found there, and the battalion withdrew. But on the night of 4th-5th September, a superior force of enemy warships sank both the Little and Gregory in Sealark Channel. The cargo ships Bellatrix and Fuller sailed into Sealark Channel on 7th September, but before they could discharge all their cargo, the threat of enemy attack forced them to retire. Escorted by 2 destroyers, they returned 1 week later, arriving at 7:30 14th September. General Vandergrift ordered the Bellatrix to unload her gasoline at Tulagi because the Lunga area was under attack. During the day, the Bellatrix also transferred the 3rd Battalion 2nd Marines from Tulagi to Guadalcanal, and at 19:15 the 4 ships departed. After the Ilu engagement on 20th-21st August, the Marines fought no major engagements until mid-September. An attempt in late August by the 1st Battalion of the 5th Marines to clear the enemy out of the Kokumbona area had failed to accomplish substantial results. Japanese forces were again gathering east of the Ilu. Native scouts had reported in late August that about 200 or 300 well-equipped Japanese were building defensive works at the village of Tasimoko, some 18 miles east of Lunga Point. In early September, the native scouts reported that the enemy force at Tasimoko numbered several thousand troops instead of 200 or 300. Division headquarters discounted this information but determined to destroy the force at Tasimoko by a hit-and-run raid. The force selected for the raid consisted of a provisional battalion composed of the 1st Raider and 1st Parachute Battalions under Colonel Edson's command. The two understrength units, rested after their hard fighting on 7th–8th August, had been brought to Guadalcanal from Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, and formed, with their companies intact, into a provisional battalion. The raiders and parachutists were to sail from Lunga to a point east of Tasimoko on destroyer transports, and land in the rear of the enemy. Because there were not enough ships, the destroyer transports carried the raider companies to Tasimoko first, then returned to Lunga Point for the parachutists. The raider companies landed east of Tasimoko at dawn on 8 September, followed by the parachute companies. Advancing west, the raiders met a weak enemy force shortly after daybreak. They overran a Japanese outpost unit and captured one battery of light artillery. Supported by P-400s and SBDs from Henderson Field, they pushed west to the outskirts of Tasimoko where enemy resistance grew stronger. But the raiders pressed their attack and forced the Japanese to evacuate the village. During the raid, the Marines destroyed large stores of medical equipment, ammunition, radios, landing craft, 4 75mm guns, and one 37mm gun. At a cost to themselves of 2 annihilated and 6 wounded, they annihilated 27 Japanese. Contact with the enemy was lost at 12:30, and the Marines returned east to board the transports. The raiders had set out expecting to find a few exhausted and poorly armed Japanese. Instead, they had met elements of a strong force with artillery support, which General Vandergrift subsequently estimated to number between 3,000 and 4,000 men. The enemy had avoided action with the small raiding force which had engaged only the outposts. The fact that the Japanese main body did not attack the raiders is surprising, for the natives' reports had been correct. A strong enemy force had been landed near Taivu Point. The units which the raiders had met were part of the recently landed Kawaguchi Force. This force, the nucleus of which was Colonel Akinosuke Oka's 124th Infantry, had originally been the 35th Brigade, a part of the 18th Division in China, until that division was triangularized in December 1941 and sent to Burma. On 6 December 1941, the Kawaguchi Force sailed from China for Borneo and landed there on 16 December. In March 1942, it arrived at Cebu in the Philippines, then proceeded to Mindanao in April. In June 1942, the Kawaguchi Force left for the Palau Islands, where it received 1,000 replacements. It was then alerted for New Guinea. The force stayed in the Palaus until late August, when it departed to stage through truck and sail in successive echelons for Guadalcanal. The Kawaguchi Force echelons arrived at Guadalcanal between 29 August and 11 September. They landed at night from destroyer, transports and transports. The force was composed of the Ichiki Force rear echelon, a part of the reinforced 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry, the 124th Infantry and the 2nd Battalion, 4th Infantry, plus anti-tank, signal, engineer, and artillery elements. It included over 6,000 men. The 1st Marine Division's report subsequently estimated that total enemy strength on Guadalcanal at this time amounted to 7,000 men. The majority of the Kawaguchi Force, the 1st and 3rd Battalions, 124th Infantry, and the Ichiki rear echelon had landed with General Kawaguchi near Taivu in late August and early September. Colonel Oka, with his regimental headquarters and the 2nd Battalion, 124th Infantry, landed at Kokumbona west of Lunga Point on 6 September. The 2nd Battalion, 4th Infantry, was normally a part of the 2nd Division but was attached temporarily to General Kawaguchi's command. By the time the last units had landed, General Kawaguchi had assembled over 6,000 men, but they were divided between two widely separated points. On 8 September, the main body was in the vicinity of Taivu Point, while Colonel Oka with a smaller force was in the vicinity of Kokumbona, more than 30 miles west of Kawaguchi's position. Kawaguchi had been ordered to reconnoiter and decide whether his men were capable of seizing the airfield at once, or if they should first be reinforced. Confidently believing that reinforcements were unnecessary, he determined to attack immediately. About 2 September, Kawaguchi's engineers, using hand tools, started to cut a trail from Tasimoko through the jungle toward a point south of Henderson Field. Tough vines, heavy undergrowth, dense forest, and steep ravines and ridges along the route of approach made all movement difficult in that area. As the trail progressed, infantry and artillery units followed the engineers. Documents captured later indicated that the Japanese had planned a coordinated attack, with strong air and naval surface support against 3 separate sectors. The plan involved moving against the Lunga defenses from the west, south, and east. The western force was out of physical contact with Kawaguchi's main body, which was then proceeding through the jungle toward the 1st Marine Division's south and east flanks. The 1st Marine Division headquarters was well aware that an attack was impending. Land patrols, observation posts, and patrolling aircraft were furnishing data on the enemy to the intelligence section. South and southeast of the Lunga defenses, patrols of Marines and native scouts clashed regularly with the Japanese. Accumulated evidence demonstrated that Kawaguchi's column was advancing toward the Lunga, but division headquarters did not know Kawaguchi's exact location until he attacked. The Marines, meanwhile, had improved their defenses. The Lunga garrison, strengthened by the raiders and parachutists, was also augmented by the 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marines, which was brought over from Tulagi on 21st August and assigned for a time as regimental reserve in the 5th Marines sector west of the Lunga River. In preparation for an attack from the east, the 1st Marines completed the extension of the east flank line to a point about 4,000 yards inland from the mouth of the Ilu. The right-south flank of the line was unprotected. In the west sector, a 4,000-yard gap between the Lunga River and the 5th Marines lines southwest of Kukum lay open in the inland area. The pioneers held one strong point in this gap on a small ridge west of the river, and amphibian tractor drivers held a second separate strong point on a large open ridge northwest of the pioneers. General Vandergrift realized that a coordinated attack could penetrate these defenses, but he expected that the reserve would be able to contain any force attacking there before it reached the airfield. East of the Lunga in the 1st Marine sector, the southern line was almost as weak. An outpost line extended across 4,000 yards of rough jungle between the east flank and the Lunga River. This line was held by the 1st Marines and by artillerymen, engineers, and pioneers. The outpost line ran north of the low ridge, later called Vicious or Edson's Ridge, which lies about 800 yards east of the Lunga River. The dense growth and the rough ridges limited fields of fire. There were not enough troops to hold a continuous line in force. At the edge of the jungle at the north end of the ridge was the division command post. General Vandergrift ordered the Raider Parachute Battalion out of division reserve to develop a defense position along Vicious Ridge, south of the outpost line. He believed that if it was undefended, the ridge would provide the enemy with a good route of approach to the airfield. The 1st Pioneer Battalion had already bivouacked northwest of the ridge along the east bank of the Lunga, and the 1st Engineer Battalion had bivouacked northeast of the ridge to help prevent the Japanese from advancing north along the Lunga or through the jungle east of the ridge. On 12 September, the Raider Parachute Battalion attempted to patrol south along the ridge, but met enemy rifle fire. The battalion dug in for the night on the southernmost knoll. During the night of 12-13 September, there was continuous firing along the ridge. That the enemy had penetrated to the jungles around the ridge was obvious, but the dense growth and the blackness of the night limited visibility from Vicious Ridge. At one time during the night, some Japanese actually broke through the sketchy positions of the Raider Parachute Battalion, but apparently failed to realize it, for they made no effort to exploit their advantage. The Raider Parachute Battalion attempted a further advance after daybreak on 13 September, but failed to gain. Exhausted by fighting in the heat, it halted in the afternoon to establish a slightly stronger, higher position about 250 yards north of its bivouac of 12-13 August. On the right, the raiders had made a tenuous connection with the pioneers, but the left flank was open. The 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marines, then in Division Reserve, moved to the south edge of the airfield on the afternoon of 13th September to effect the relief of the Raider Parachute Battalion the next morning. One battery of the 5th Battalion, 11th Marines with 105mm howitzers, had been assigned to provide direct support to the ridge area. Men from the 11th Marine Special Weapons Battery maintained an observation post on the ridge. In the afternoon, the battery had registered on areas in the south, but accurate plotting was impossible because there were no reliable maps. On the ridge itself, 2 companies of parachutists were holding the eastern spur of the center knoll, with their left flank uncovered. B Company of the raiders held the center of the knoll on the parachutists' right. Posted on the right between the ridge and the Lunga River was a company, and C Company was the battalion reserve. During the last hours of daylight on 13th September, the troops dug in and extended their fields of fire. Enemy aircraft attacked Lunga Point repeatedly during the day. American fighter planes forced one wave of bombers to turn back, but at 10, 20, 13, 20, and 17. 50 Japanese bombers protected by fighter escort came over to attack Henderson Field and positions adjacent to the ridge. Shortly after nightfall on 13th September, rocket flares over Vicious Ridge announced the opening of an attack by at least 2 battalions of the Kawaguchi Force. Without any artillery preparation, the main body attacked north against the center of the ridge, while one force cut through the jungle west of the ridge and isolated the right platoon of B Company of the Raiders and cut off A Company. Though surrounded, the platoon from B Company fought its way about 250 yards to the rear to join the battalion reserve on the northernmost knoll. The Japanese exploited the gap between the Raider companies and the Pioneer companies by moving strong parties in, while at other points small groups infiltrated through to cut telephone wires. B Company of the Raiders, in danger of envelopment, refused its right flank along the western slopes of the ridge. The registered battery of the 5th Battalion, 11th Marines, opened fire on the enemy at 21 hours, joined shortly thereafter by a 2nd and then a 3rd battery. All batteries fired over the heads of the Marines on the ridge. As the enemy attack grew in intensity, the 5th Battalion began firing heavy concentrations. Communications between the Fire Direction Center and the forward observers were broken for about 2 hours, but the artillery continued to fire without observation. While continuing the attack against B Company on the center of the ridge, the Japanese put heavy mortar fire on the parachutists' positions on B Company's left. At 22:30, shouting loudly, the Japanese infantry stormed the parachutists' lines and drove them back off their eastern spur. This exposed B Company to attack from 3 sides. Colonel Edson, commanding the Raider Parachute Battalion, decided to withdraw B Company from its dangerous position and to rally his forces on the northern knoll of Vicious Ridge, the battalion reserve line. Using C Company of the Raiders as a nucleus, Colonel Edson and Major Kenneth Bailey, the executive officer, successfully re-established the lines on the last knoll in front of Henderson Field and the division command post. The Japanese, continuing their attacks, advanced uphill against artillery, mortar, machine gun and rifle fire and grenades. As at the Ilu, these attacks failed to break the last lines. Kawaguchi's forces attacked Vicious Ridge about 12 times during the night. The direction and objective of every attack was preceded by a rocket flare, each of which served as a point of reference for the fire of the 5th Battalion, 11th Marines. From 21 hours, 13th September, until dawn the next day, the 105mm howitzer batteries fired 1,992 rounds in support of the Raider Parachute Battalion at ranges as short as 1,600 yards. They sometimes put shells within 200 yards of the front lines, which was generally considered to be an unusually short distance in the early days of the war. By 2:30, Colonel Edson had concluded that his troops could hold out, although they were still under attack. As morning drew near, the vigor of the Japanese attacks declined. By dawn of 14th September, the Raider Parachute Battalion was still holding the last knoll on Vicious Ridge. The Japanese attacks had ceased. After aircraft took off from Henderson Field and drove the remaining enemy from Vicious Ridge, the Kawaguchi force began to retreat. While the main enemy body was attacking Vicious Ridge, a 2nd unit of the Kawaguchi force had attacked west about midnight against the right flank of the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, on the Ilu. Here the line lay along the edge of the jungle in front of a 700-yard deep flat, grassy plain to the east. The front was wired in. Fields of fire had been prepared by burning and trampling the grass. The right end of the line was without flank protection and thus was open to envelopment. About 2 companies of Japanese attacked against the front of the right flank unit, but failed to penetrate the line. A firefight developed which lasted throughout the night, but the 1st Marines' positions were never seriously endangered. During the day, Division Headquarters, believing that the force still facing the 1st Marines on the east flank was composed of 1 infantry battalion supported by artillery, sent 6 light tanks across the plain to destroy the enemy. When they made repeated sorties over the same routes of approach, 3 tanks were hit by anti-tank gunfire and 1 overturned in a creek. The Japanese did not attack the 1st Marines again, but engaged the right flank of the east line with desultory fire until 16th September. A 3rd Japanese force, probably under Colonel Oka's command, struck on the afternoon of 14th September in the west sector. Part of the 3rd Battalion of the 5th Marines was holding the sector from the coast inland to a ridge which commanded the coastal road. The Japanese, debouching from the jungles, struck suddenly at the ridge but failed to take it, and were driven back down the slopes by infantry counterattacks and artillery fire. The exact composition of the 3 Japanese attacking forces is not clear. The 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 124th Infantry and the 2nd Battalion of the 4th Infantry probably delivered the attack against Vicious Ridge, while the Ichiki Force rear echelon may have attacked 1st Marines, The 2nd Battalion, 124th Infantry, probably delivered the weak attack against the 5th Marines on 14th September. Marine casualties on Vicious Ridge were about 20% of the total force engaged. 31 were annihilated, 103 wounded, and 9 missing. The Japanese casualties were much higher. Of an estimated 2,000 who attacked Vicious Ridge, about 600 were annihilated on the ridge itself. After its repulse, the Kawaguchi force began to retreat, carrying its wounded in litters. The Japanese had entered the action with only a few days' rations, and these seemed to have been quickly exhausted. About 400 men of the 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry, and Ichiki's rear echelon made their way east to Coley Point. Some troops of the 2nd Battalion, 4th Infantry, were also reported to have gone to Coley Point. The remainder of the Kawaguchi force retreated to the west by cutting a trail around the rough southern slopes of Mount Austin to Kokumbona. Many of the wounded died, and the weakened survivors buried dead soldiers, heavy equipment, and artillery pieces along the way. The journey took over a week. The Japanese reported that 633 men were annihilated in action, and 505 wounded. That the Kawaguchi force could offer no immediate threat to Henderson Field was indicated in the week following the Vicious Ridge action. Marine patrols fought a series of successful engagements with Japanese units along the upper reaches of the Lunga River. They found stocks of the equipment, ammunition, small arms, and guns of 2 field artillery batteries which the Kawaguchi force had abandoned. The second and more formidable threat to Henderson Field had been successfully averted. By mid-September, the Marines, besides capturing the airfield, had fought 2 successful defensive actions and conducted minor offensive actions in the Matanikau area. Neither combat reinforcements nor additional ammunition had yet been sent to Guadalcanal. When Vandergrift had persuaded Turner in August that the 2nd Marines should remain with the 1st Division, he had also asked Turner to consider sending the 7th Marines from Samoa to rejoin the division on Guadalcanal. Allied aerial reconnaissance in September showed that the Japanese were building up their strength at Rabaul, and Admiral Gormley concluded that the Japanese could be expected to continue their ground operations in New Guinea and to mount a large-scale counteroffensive to retake the Lunga airfield. Turner believed that until the Allies could muster sufficient strength to keep the Japanese air and surface forces away from Guadalcanal, additional positions there should be established outside the Lunga defences. These additional positions should be strong enough to withstand direct enemy attack. From these new positions, patrols could destroy enemy forces which succeeded in landing elsewhere along the coast. On 9 September, Turner recommended to Gormley that the reinforced 7th Marines establish the first additional position at Taivu Point, about 25 statute miles east of Lunga Point. Admiral Gormley decided to withhold his final decision until Turner visited Guadalcanal to decide whether the 7th Marines could be used more advantageously at Taivu or at Lunga Point. The 7th Marines and part of the 5th Defence Battalion had embarked on 7 ships at Samoa on 2nd September with equipment and vehicles. The ships had sailed under escort for Espiritu Santo, where they arrived on 12th September. While en route, the commanders of the Transport Division, the 7th Marines, and the 5th Defence Battalion Detachment had been ordered to prepare landing plans for both Ndeni and Taivu Point. In the meantime, Admiral Turner had flown to Guadalcanal to confer with General Vandergrift, who wished the 7th Marines to reinforce the Lunga defences. They agreed that while a wide deployment along the coast would be essential for ultimate security, the most pressing need was the reinforcement of the Lunga area by the 7th Marines. Admiral Turner presented these recommendations to Admiral Gormley on 12th September, and the next day Gormley ordered the 7th Marines to reinforce the Guadalcanal garrison as soon as possible. The 5th Defence Battalion Detachment remained at Espiritu Santo for a time, and on 2nd October occupied the island of Funafuti in the Ellis Group, about 1,250 miles to the east of Guadalcanal. For the movement of the 7th Marines to Guadalcanal, Admiral Turner organized a new task force, Task Force 65. The transport group of the force consisted of 2 transport divisions of 3 ships each. The 7th Marines, reinforced, including the 1st Battalion of the 11th Marines with 75mm pack howitzers, comprised the landing force. 3 cruisers, including the New Zealand cruiser Leander, plus destroyers and minesweepers were to screen the transports. Task Force 65, under Turner's command, sailed from Espiritu Santo at 5:15 a.m. 14th September. The situation was delicate. The remaining Allied naval forces in the South Pacific were supporting Turner's force, but were inferior in strength to the Japanese. Many enemy ships were present in the Solomons waters. On 15th September, Turner decided not to continue toward Guadalcanal, for some Japanese warships had been reported to be operating near Santa Cruz and the Shortlands, and warships were shelling the Lunga area almost nightly. He did not wish to risk being attacked by the Japanese during debarkation. At 15 hours, 15th September, his force retired to a point southeast of San Cristobal to await more favorable conditions. 24 hours later, the force turned north toward the east end of San Cristobal to be in position to land the 7th Marines on Guadalcanal on 18th September. As the Japanese did not attack, Admiral Turner decided on 17th September to proceed with the landing plans. General Vandergrift had wished to extend the east flank of the Lunga position 1 mile beyond the Ilu, and the 7th Marines were to have landed at Beach Red. After the night battle of 13th–14th September, he decided not to extend his flank and suggested that the 7th Marines land between the Lunga and the Ilu rivers. As heavy weather and rolling seas made this area unusable, Admiral Turner decided to land at Kukum where the beach was more sheltered. He planned to spend no more than 12 hours unloading off Kukum, as his force would have to clear Sealark Channel before nightfall to avoid enemy warships. He desired to put ashore within that time all troops, weapons and essential equipment, 3 units of fire, 40 days' rations, and the vehicles carried on board the 6 transports. The force anchored off Kukum on the morning of 18th September, and by 5:50 a.m. had begun unloading. As Japanese aircraft did not attack during the day, unloading operations proceeded without interruption until 18 hours. The McFarland and the Tracy also sailed into the channel about 10 o'clock, followed by the Bellatrix at 13 hours, and all 3 ships, which were not part of Task Force 65, began unloading an emergency shipment of aviation gasoline. The results of the day's operations, according to Turner, actually exceeded his expectations. 4,180 men of the reinforced 7th Marines came safely ashore. 147 vehicles were landed, together with 90% of the engineering equipment, 82.5% of the organizational equipment, nearly all the ammunition, 82 tons of B rations, 930 tons of C and D rations, nearly all quartermaster stores, and 60% of the tentage. The Macaulay, Bellatrix, McFarland and Tracy put 3,823 drums of fuel ashore. Still on board were 13 officers and 244 enlisted men, 15 tanks, 8,825 tons of B, C and D rations, and 73 vehicles. The ammunition landed at this time was the first shipment which the 1st Marine Division had received in response to its request for 10,000 rounds of 37mm canister and 10,000 hand grenades on 22nd August. Turner's force, having taken on board the 1st Parachute Battalion, 162 American wounded, and 8 Japanese prisoners, sailed for Espiritu Santo at 18 hours, 18th September, followed by the gasoline ships. Enemy warships entered Sealark Channel from the north on the night of 18th–19th September, but did not pursue the retiring task force. Because Japanese warships regularly operated in Sealark Channel at night, Admiral Turner specified on 24th September that any vessels carrying supplies to Lunga Point were to unload only during daylight. If not fully unloaded, they were to retire eastward out of the channel at night and return to the point at dawn. Following these orders, the Betelgeuse, escorted by 1 destroyer, unloaded off Lunga Point from 6:28 to 18:30, 24th September, and then retired eastward. The ships returned at 5:30 the next morning to discharge cargo, and withdrew again for the night. They anchored once more off Lunga Point at 6:30 a.m. 26th September to resume unloading. During the same morning, the Alhena, escorted by 1 destroyer, sailed into Sealark Channel to unload. The Betelgeuse and her escort retired, completely unloaded, at 15 hours. The Alhena sailed out of the channel at 20:45, returned the next morning, and continued the process until 12 o'clock 29th September, when she had discharged all her cargo. Admiral Turner's orders on 29th September defined ships' operations more explicitly. Thereafter, ships of the amphibious force were to load cargo specifically either for Guadalcanal or Tulagi. Unless otherwise ordered, they were to load no more than 3,000 tons, a quantity which could be unloaded in 24 hours. Ships discharging cargo off Guadalcanal, standing in the open channel, were to unload only during daylight, but ships unloading in the greater security of Tulagi Harbour could unload continuously. By about 18th September, logistic support of the 1st Marine Division had improved sufficiently to restore full rations to all combat troops. By the end of the month, the Guadalcanal garrison's troop strength was still low. 19,251 men were on Guadalcanal, 3,260 on Tulagi,